Welcome to another episode of Emerging Environments. First of all, we just wanted to thank everyone who has reached out to express their interest and support for the podcast. The general sentiment that we've been hearing is that people feel that we need to be having more conversations about environmental issues. So we're happy to fill that niche.
Today on the podcast, we're speaking with Dr. Matthew Mitchell and Dr. Aerin Jacob. Matt is a landscape ecologist working as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of British Columbia. He received his PhD from McGill University in 2014, and he has published extensively on a range of topics, including the ecological effects of landscape fragmentation and the supporting role that biodiversity plays in agricultural productivity.
Aerin is a conservation scientist working at the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. Aerin also received her PhD from McGill in 2014 and has published many research papers on the science policy interface as it relates to environmental management and the role of spatial planning for protected area creation and management.
The main reason we wanted to speak to Matt and Aerin together is because they were co-authors on a recently published article about measuring, mapping, and protecting ecosystem services in Canada. So we talked a lot about their research paper, digging into the methods that they used and the implications of their results, but also about the different values that we place on nature, access to nature and the benefits that ecosystems provide, the state of the science for ecosystem services, and the competing demands of conservation and economic development.
It was a really enjoyable chat and a pleasure to hear from two emerging leaders in the fields of conservation and landscape science. So let's get to the conversation. So thank you, Aerin and Matthew, for joining us today. We're so excited to talk to you. And the way that we typically start off our interviews is for us to learn a little bit more about you. Where did you grow up? How did you get interested in science? So Aerin, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I was born in Toronto and I spent most of my childhood overseas. I grew up in East Africa and then Northern Ontario, different parts of British Columbia, and bounced around for work and grad school. I was interested in science from an early age. My mom worked in international development and where we lived, that was so clear that people were reliant on ecosystems and also the role that decision-making, often centralized decision-making by governments far away, made people's lives change. So I was really interested in those kind of things from an early age, asked a lot of questions about why, and had very patient adults who would talk about it.
Cool. And Matthew, what about you?
So I was born in Williams Lake in British Columbia, so kind of in the center of BC, but then moved to Victoria, just outside Victoria when I was 10. So grew up in there. My dad actually worked for the Ministry of Forests for over 30 years. So he was involved in research in forestry and worked in land use planning. So creating land resource management plans in the province. So he was doing a lot of that and creating protected areas and old growth strategy, all of that sort of stuff growing up. And my mom is a botanical artist and so does watercolor painting. So kind of a natural fit for me to think about botany and ecology and forests and how those things, were important and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I mean, I always grew up hiking and spending lots of time outdoors and talking with my parents about land planning and that sort of stuff. So it probably isn't a surprise that I ended up where I am now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you both seem like you had an interest in ecosystems and what they can, provide at a very young age. So that's pretty cool. So I will pass it over to Stu, and he'll ask some questions about, your current research and get to know a little bit more about what you guys are working on right now.
Thanks, Karen. I think first I was wondering how you both kind of classify yourselves. Like what bin do you put yourselves in? I know you put on lots of different hats, and that's evident in this paper that we'll talk about that just came out. But I was wondering, maybe Matthew, if you want to start, but do you have sort of a general way you introduce yourself?
It's always a tough question because I'm pretty interdisciplinary. I think maybe I've settled on a landscape ecologist. So, because I often work at kind of broad scales and large landscape scales, but within that, there's a huge diversity of stuff I think I work on. I work on ecology and I work on land use change, but I also think about social ecological systems, so people. I'm working here in this paper that we're talking about is around conservation, but I'm actually in a land and food systems faculty. So I'm thinking a lot about agriculture. And in the past, I've actually worked in urban landscapes. So
Wow.
it's the great thing about working in something like the area of kind of ecosystem services is that ecosystem services are really diverse, and they range from things like food that we grow and eat, all the way to like cultural benefits, education that we get, places to recreate. And so within that, you can go a lot of different places depending on what you're interested in.
Yeah.
It's fun. Yeah.
Yeah. How about you, Aerin?
Yeah, it's similarly, I find it hard to define sometimes. And I guess most broadly, I'm a conservation scientist. So different types of, I'm trained as an ecologist, and that's most of my work. But increasingly, like Matt, I do more and more interdisciplinary stuff, and more often where I'm not the expert, but I'm convening people who are on a variety of things and kind of taking that really big picture view of how do we connect and protect landscapes. And at Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, where I work, we focus specifically on Western North America. But I've done work in many different places on that. And most broadly, it's the relationships people and have with nature, different ways that we manage landscapes, and the costs and benefits, the trade-offs of those kind of decisions, both for people and for wildlife.
Yeah, I think both of you are deeply, immersed in that kind of socio-ecological type of framework for how we think about conservation and protection and all those kinds of things. So maybe that's a nice lead into the paper that just came out there. You're both co-authors on, Matthew, the lead author there. So first of all, congratulations on the paper. I think it seems to be, taking a few next steps in the topic of ecosystem services. But maybe first of all, I guess that topic itself, for those that might listen to this and maybe haven't heard that term or are not familiar with that idea, could you just explain it a little bit, what it means to you and how you think it's applicable for conservation? Maybe Aerin, you want to jump on that one?
Sure. Ecosystem services, it's a technical term. Really, what it boils down to is the benefits that people get from nature. And we get all kinds of benefits from nature, everything from beautiful places that inspire us to helping to regulate the climate, to the fresh water that, you're drinking a cup of coffee right now, or if you had a shower this morning, that comes from nature. And so, thanks. This paper it's been a long time in the works, and it's great to have it published, and even more exciting to think about how it's going to be used.
Yeah, so I've been reading myself about the idea of ecosystem services for some time. And one thing that's a little unclear to me is, whether or not it's kind of been translated to the public. We think about conservation and biodiversity a lot in protected areas, but I was wondering if you think, has it sort of reached the general public? Does it need to? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. The interesting thing is that, the term ecosystem service was first kind of put forward more as an educational kind of term about to bring forward the importance of ecosystems and nature for people. And then, a lot of it's now being used by scientists and that sort of side of things, and to know whether the public actually understands it. I think that people are more and more interested in it. I think that there's a growing, when I talk about ecosystem services, there's, when I think I started 10 years ago, often it was lots of people hadn't heard of the term, and you had to kind of explain it. More and more people are definitely heard the term and are kind of aware of the benefits that nature provides them. Whether that's translated into actually, understanding the diversity of ways that happens, how our actions affect those benefits, and whether it's been actually, into conservation decisions as much as it could, I think is probably an open question. Maybe it hasn't done that yet, but I think from an awareness standpoint, people are more aware of those benefits. I think it definitely has done that.
Yeah, I'd agree with Matt. There's a lot of people think about these things in different ways. They'll talk about, we're hunting and fishing, and that puts food on the table for people, or we're spending time in nature with your family. And they wouldn't put it under that umbrella of ecosystem services, or governments have to think about, we've got to think about where our water comes from for people, or perhaps they don't think about that as much as they ought to. So it's, putting it into this grander idea of like, what are the trade-offs of all those different decisions? It's at the heart of land use planning. But I think it's that combination of who benefits, who doesn't, where does it come from, the places it comes from doesn't necessarily mean it gets to people or gets to all people. All of those decisions are really interesting in this field.
Yeah, I know one thing that's happening sort of at the global scale now is that idea itself is kind of morphing into this new umbrella term called nature's contributions to people, which is kind of reflective of that, the idea that you're just talking about. There's sort of, differential value and differential perceptions of different benefits we get from ecosystems. It's by no means, a catch-all term that's meant to capture everybody's values. So that, I don't know, have you come across that? I imagine you have that new concept, that new sort of iteration of it.
Yeah, so one of the co-authors on the paper, Kai Chan, who's also at the University of British Columbia, he was one of the people that was on that original paper and with a group of people that kind of coined the term, nature's contributions to people. And so that term itself, I think, was kind of a response to the fact that ecosystem services over the last 20 years has really been used in a lot of ways to put monetary values on nature, and it's very, it's an anthropocentric kind of term where it's like nature's providing this to us, and it doesn't capture a lot of the ways that different groups, especially indigenous peoples, actually kind of conceive of nature and see where their place is in it. And so I think through the IPBS process, Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, they came to this realization that there's a lot of people that don't, the ecosystem services term doesn't really resonate with them. And so that term came out of it. And I think it's a really, I don't know if we need another term, but I think that the observation that this isn't capturing how people actually view their relationship with nature and how, is a really important one, and something that we need to bring into ecosystem services research if we actually want to, connect with people and understand how people want to manage and interact with nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe a quick follow-up to that. So that idea and, recognizing that sort of differential perception and valuation, when we talk about ecosystem service, the idea of capacity and demand, which you explored in your paper, how do you carry forward that recognition that demand is not, a monolithic thing? Do you have any ideas on how the idea itself can move forward and recognize that kind of differential demand? I don't know. That's a tough question, but.
It's a big question. And the good questions are the tough questions, right? All these things we have to wrestle with, and what it means for justice and for people's access to these things, and to evaluate that based on many different dimensions of what it means to be a person or in populations that not all people have access to. Think about recreation, for instance, is a classic one. Tons of aspects of recreation are super privileged. Who has the money to do it? Who can travel to some of the places? Who has the knowledge, or even conceives of recreation in that way, that I'm going to go out to have this marvelous experience in these fantastic places. And Canada is full of those kind of places, but not everybody has access to it. So I think that absolutely has to be thought about going forward, and particularly as people are looking at how to apply these kind of techniques and results that our paper looks at. How do you look at that on a more local scale, on a regional scale? I don't think it's possible really to do on a national scale like this, but absolutely it has to factor in at a local scale. We can't keep providing more and more benefits for people who already have the most benefits from nature, and make decisions about it, right?
Yeah.
And I would just say from a practical standpoint too, I told Aerin's points are great, and especially about the more local scales to understand these things. On our paper, it's primarily natural scientists on that paper. There's a couple that do a lot more interdisciplinary studies, but I think it's actually natural scientists pairing with social scientists so that you can actually get at those values, that you can actually, you're serving people, you're talking to people, you're understanding how they interact with ecosystems. And that's where the kind of interdisciplinary science needs to come out to understand those different values and perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just take it back a step in terms of this current paper. One of the things you point out in the paper is that in terms of ecosystem services, the focus has really been on capacity, and looking at demand is sort of a relatively new dimension. And so can you speak a little bit to that and why there's been that shift, or you're interested in kind of the intersection between capacity and demand, and how that plays out in terms of planning and, thinking about those things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think demand is something that hasn't been integrated as much as it probably should be. And I mean, I'll give you an example of why we thought demand was so important. Mm-hmm. If you think about something like water, if you've got a watershed or a river that's flowing and there's lots of water there, but if that river's flowing straight into the ocean, it's important for ecosystems. It might be important for fisheries. It's providing some benefits. But if that river is flowing downstream to an agricultural area or a city or a dam, all of a sudden those benefits are different, and the value might be a lot different for people. And also, how many people are actually downstream of that? Is it a small community or is it a city? And so, bringing in that piece of services, since its benefits to people, is really important if you want to actually target places, the most important places in a certain region for conservation. And so I think that's increasingly kind of realized in ecosystem services literature, that it's not just about, how much water you have or whether it's a natural area or that sort of thing. It's like, wait, how are people actually interacting with that capacity? And if you don't have, you can have different types of interactions or different levels of interactions that are really important to include there.
Yeah, Matt's spot on with that. And water for me was one of the driving forces here. And part of it is because the organization I work for works across all kinds of boundaries. And the idea is nature doesn't recognize people's boundaries, right? Mm-hmm, so we were seeing things like the water that comes from for instance, the east side of the Rocky Mountains. So think about areas that are, near Edmonton or Red Deer or Calgary. That water flows all the way across the prairies and is used by people all the way across the prairies to feed all of us. And so it means that the people who live there should have some say in what's happening upstream and how those places are managed. And they often don't. So it's that aspect of how do you identify who's affected by these decisions? Mm-hmm.
That kind of leads into a question that I had about just sort of general, we are academics, we, publish these papers and they have these really, what I think are very important findings. And then how do you take that, academic paper and convince decision makers and people who are doing these kind of making these planning decisions that this is something important to consider, especially when it becomes like a transboundary kind of issue? And how do you bring all those people to the table and communicate what you found so that it can actually be realized?
It's like a grand experiment in every time, how do you figure out how to do this? Yeah. And I certainly wouldn't say that, we've got it all figured out. This paper, this project itself is a super interesting example of federal, provincial decision makers, also local, and like people who are elected to represent people, right? All part of our formal governments, but also landowners, just ranching groups that have gotten in touch. And so I guess we break it down by thinking about, in Canada, people have our governments have different jurisdictions, right? So the federal government is responsible for some stuff, the provincial governments are responsible for other stuff. And you have to know the difference of those things to begin with. You can't go and talk to the feds about something and they're just going to say, oh, that's the provinces to deal with. So you have to do a bit of your homework yourself, and or talk to people who know about that. And often people in the nonprofit community pay a lot of attention to those things. So that's one. And another one is we worked hard to communicate the results of the paper. Both Matt and I did numerous interviews, in print, on radio and video, and podcasts like this, where we get to talk in more detail about the process of it. And although that publicity is not change in real life, is not conservation change, it opens the doors, because it means that more and more people who live in some of these places, who live, in Northern Ontario, or who live in Montreal or Edmonton, are now paying attention to that a bit more. And certainly part of our outreach going forward is with people who are looking at regional land use plans, a lot of Indigenous communities, because one of the amazing things for us to see in these results are that a lot of the hotspots that our paper identified have also been identified by Indigenous communities in their land use plans as places that are important for conservation of a variety of reasons that might not be carbon, water, or recreation that we looked at. So it's trying to explain in really clear terms what's at stake with the, what do the data say? What do the results say? What do they not say as well? You want to be clear about that. And how does it affect people's decisions, and offer it as here's an additional layer to help your decision making.
And so do you find that all the publicity that you've been getting, that you have been getting some calls and some feedback from people, and do you feel that you're actually getting some traction?
Certainly getting a lot of emails and phone calls about it. I think both Matt and I, our inboxes have been pretty busy in the last month, which is great, right? The stuff, you do this work for a long time and it sits in review, and you think, boy, is anybody ever going to use it? Or has the time window closed? And it hasn't. I think it's too early to tell about actual change, and some of that will be hard to measure, right? This will be one factor that people will use as they make decisions. But yeah, certainly, Matt, you've had some different inquiries than I have as well. Like, that's why it's important to work together.
What I was going to say too is, as a quote unquote academic, a little bit more than Aerin, since Erin's in a conservation NGO, one of the things that I found was pairing with Aerin and having her on the team to, facilitate a bunch of this communication. Erin's fantastic at this, and, through her Libra training and all sorts of stuff. That was a huge eye opener about how much work and planning actually goes into making sure that you're communicating the science in ways that are effective. The other thing I think that was really important for this paper was that this came out of work that Aerin and I and another co-author were a part of an expert task team that was put together by Environment Canada, and was specifically around how is Canada going to get to 17% protected areas by 2020, which we didn't get to. But out of that, they tasked us with saying, looking at how do we identify areas that are important for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And out of that process, we realized that, Canada didn't have that information about ecosystem services. And so it wasn't a completely academic research question driven process. It was like, oh, this is something that they might find useful. They have no one's done it, let's do it. And so that, because the question kind of came out of that process, I think it's a lot more relevant for decision makers, and I'm hopeful that they'll actually use it, and it's more likely that they'll use it, which I think is
100%. Yeah, Matt's right on. And then follow up with those relationships, right? Like it was 3.5 years ago that we were doing that work with federal government representatives and others. And so it's following up over time to say, we're investigating that. Oh, is that still useful? And kind of tweaking it. I think that doesn't happen as often as certainly I would like it to in university-driven research. And there's that divide between a lot of the time people who work in government, because there are thousands and thousands of scientists who work in government who do research and who publish it, and it's often driven by applied needs. And from sitting in my role in the nonprofit sector and working with communities too, we would really love it if a lot more people in universities were able to really harness that power, that scholarly power, to ask questions and follow up with us and truly work with us on that kind of research. Because otherwise papers get published, they sit behind a paywall, nobody ever uses it. And I gotta say, it is so tremendously rewarding to do research that actually might be used. It's really exciting to do that. It feels good. We need more stuff that feels good these days.
Yeah, absolutely. That Yeah, I that's really interesting to hear kind of the whole process, and that there was like, government buy-in, and that it was like a collaborative process that does kind of give you some good feelings that this will actually carry forward. So I guess also I think we've been kind of jumping around a little bit in terms of this particular study, but maybe you could take us to kind of the sort of the key messages of the paper in terms of, what are the implications for protected areas, and how, the government's goal of 17% or, 30%, I think, right, is the ultimate goal. So maybe you could speak a little bit to the message from the paper about that.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that. So there's a couple main messages from the paper. The first one is one that we've touched on already, is that this difference between capacity and demand. And so one of the things we looked at was, if you look at hotspots of capacity versus hotspots of demand, do they overlap a lot in Canada? And they don't. It's, maybe a quarter to a third of the capacity hotspots overlap with hotspots for provision, so the actual delivery of a benefit to people. And so the message there is that we can't just focus on the capacity to provide benefits. We actually have to look at the demand. We need to understand that if we want to actually protect benefits for people in Canada. And so that's an important message about how we actually measure these benefits in the places that are important. The other one is, we looked at kind of the overlap of these three services that we looked at: carbon, freshwater, and recreation, to see at a national scale where are the places where, if maybe we conserve them, we can get all three at once. And there's very little of those triple overlaps. I think it was, it's 0.5% of Canada, and mainly in Manitoba is the place where you've got, lots of carbon in the soil, and you've got fresh water, and you've got places to recreate. That's kind of the sweet spot.
Those Manitobans, they're living the dream out there.
Exactly. Yeah, there you go. I mean, one thing I will say is the scale that you do the analysis changes your answers. So if you did the same analysis for Alberta or for Ontario, all of a sudden different hotspots would come out. The national hotspots would still be there, but additional important places would come out at those jurisdictions. So anyways, finding those win-win-wins is going to be maybe more challenging. And then the last piece that we looked at was kind of, how well are we protecting those, and what are the other potential threats to those important areas? And, our national parks network, not just national parks, but provincial as well, our entire protected areas network, does a pretty good job of looking at both kind of capacity and the provision of the benefits, but it does focus, it does emphasize a little bit more the capacity part. And that's often because we put parks where people aren't, right? We put them up north. There were places where there's not those competing land uses. And then so that the message there is that maybe we can do that a little bit better. And then the last piece is that, about how, I think it's about a third to 2/3 of those hotspots overlap with current resource tenures. So things like logging, mining, oil and gas, that sort of thing. And so these aren't places that are places where we can just go in and put a park without talking with all of those land users. And also we weren't able to formally do this, but there's also Indigenous communities, and basically every part of Canada is Indigenous land. And so the complexity about how you actually protect these and who has to be part of that process is another thing that we touch on in the paper.
Yeah, I had maybe a follow-up to that, thinking about area that's either undergoing resource extraction right now or is set to do so in the future, where something like environmental assessments are in play for those activities, those development, what have you. So I know you both have a depth of experience on that topic itself, but I was curious to hear your thoughts on whether you think the ecosystem services concept has a place in environmental assessment for those kinds of things. So if we're identifying these hotspots across the landscape, do we need to sort of think about, prioritizing or weighting ecosystem services in environmental assessments? What do you think?
So I think you'd have to invite us on for another hour to talk about environmental assessment. Both Matt and I have worked as consultants doing it, and I spent a lot of time in the last 4 years trying to strengthen the science in impact assessment. So the short version is, do I think that there's a role for ecosystem services in impact assessments? Absolutely. Is it being done? Generally not. And if it's done, it's done poorly. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. A few things that come to mind are this idea of, a few years ago, people talked about government made a change to federal impact assessment and constrained who was quote directly affected, and that meant who can actually participate in these things, who can say that such and such a development directly affects me, and so it constrained public participation, which is a really big problem. And work like ours shows that people all around the world are affected by the carbon that's stored in Canada. People all across the prairies are affected by the coal mining that's proposed to happen in Alberta's eastern slopes. So this idea of who's affected, it just shows how connected we are and how dependent we are to these things. As well, I think ecosystem services and the assessment of the benefits people get from nature, we need to be thinking about development decisions as cumulative things. What are the cumulative effects that are happening? It can't just be this whack-a-mole decision making about, here's a mine, here's a dam, here's something else, all as individual decisions. We have to think about the cumulative effects of how we use land and water, and think about things like regional assessments and strategic assessments. So because impact assessment is supposed to be a planning tool, and this kind of work should go into planning. It's not just about trying to mitigate things. We often can't do a good job of mitigating it. So I'd love to see this kind of work be used more and more for impact assessment, especially at those broader spatial scales. And we need. Matt talked about at the beginning. His dad worked a lot on land use plans. If I could wave a magic wand and say one thing that will make life better for people and for nature, we need land use planning, comprehensive, informed by evidence, and at the scales that matter for people.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, Erin's exactly right. I think that the cumulative effects piece especially is really important, and needing land use plans. When I worked for a few years in Alberta doing impact assessments for oil sands projects in Northern Alberta, and that was the time when I think the Cumulative Effects Management Association came out and said, things are going so fast, we can't keep up with all of the projects, and we have no idea what the cumulative effects are. And we also, our ability to actually quantify those cumulative effects is poor as well. So there's that. I think the other thing that I was going to say when I did impact assessments was you'd often have kind of two sides of it. You'd have one side where we were inventorying which ecosystems were there that were going to be affected, what biodiversity, maybe wildlife, that sort of thing, and not really connecting it to the benefits that they provide. And then the other side, part of that impact assessment was also how many jobs is this going to create, the economic piece of it. And you're comparing those things, and they're not, it's apples and oranges. They're always apples and oranges. They're different in some ways, but I think ecosystem services allows you to have a fuller conversation about what are the benefits we're getting from this project, what are the costs, and is that something that we're willing to do based on those trade-offs. And ecosystem services gets a lot closer to being able to do that in a fuller way, and in a way that people will actually understand what those costs and benefits of the projects are.
It doesn't mean that there can't be development to these things, right? I live in a house made of wood that came out of people logging, and we need these things, but we should be very, very careful about where we do them. Places like logging old growth forest in British Columbia, that has a lot of the above ground carbon that's currently held there, and is also important habitat for caribou, mountain caribou that are endangered, for many endemic species, or endemic and other at-risk species. We have to be. It's another reason to look at very carefully at the decisions that we're making and the costs for them.
Yeah. Continuing on from thinking about the biodiversity elements and the notion of, we talked about it a bit already, but the sort of interactions between different ecosystem services and how some have interdependencies and others are more, standalone, for lack of a better term. But I was curious, so with the analysis you've done in this paper here, I was wondering what you think, sort of a biodiversity layer might look like in that type of analysis. Because we know that, we talk about biodiversity being really important for the delivery of ecosystem services, but it's not necessarily important for all of them, right? And so I was curious just to hear your thoughts on, how you would potentially integrate biodiversity into that kind of analysis. What do you think?
Oh, all right. I'll take a shot at this. This is taking me back to my my PhD comprehensive exam, because I think I got this same question about how does biodiversity fit in with ecosystem services. That was 10 years ago, and I didn't have a sufficient answer there, but neither did my committee. They were like, "That's okay. We don't think there's an answer that's good." So you're right. Biodiversity is super. It has a super complicated, multi-layered relationship with ecosystem services. In some ways, biodiversity can be a service itself if we value just the presence of this certain species or an ecosystem. It can also contribute to, like, regulation of flooding or the climate, but it can also be the product, maybe the timber, the food that we get out of it. So it's super complicated. I think that for what would a biodiversity layer look like, in across Canada? I think Aerin has done a little bit of work in that and published some stuff around there. But there's going to be places where they're going to align. There's going to be, we're going to say, oh, this is really important for biodiversity in general or for this specific species, and we get water and carbon out of here as well. There's also going to be places where that they're not going to overlap. There's going to be a certain species that live somewhere where it's often maybe we've degraded the environment and we're not getting a lot of benefits from it, but it's really important for that single species. And we're going to have the opposite as well, where this is a place that produces lots of water, and we don't actually have a lot of biodiversity there. And so I think that this actually gets back to the idea of values and what people's values are in different places, and how you make those decisions is going to be really important, because you're going to bring that data in different ways depending on what you think is most important in a certain location. If we're in a place with very little water and lots of and agriculture or people downstream, maybe we're going to prioritize that water piece of things. If we're in other places where we really want to conserve the biodiversity and there's certain specific species at risk, then that might be where the biodiversity layer comes in as more important. But I would also say, like, they're not always trade-offs. Like, we definitely need ecosystems and a certain level of biodiversity for a lot of these services, and we need to think about what those relationships are. I'm not giving a very maybe easy or simple or effective answer, but I think this gets at the complexity of land use planning for these different things.
100%. Yeah, it's a tough question.
Yeah, it's not like, oh, we can save everything all at once. We just do this one thing and we're going to get all of the services, all of the biodiversity. It's really complicated, and there's trade-offs, and we have to. I think the science can bring that evidence in and say, okay, here's what we win or lose, and then it's probably a messy process about deciding, okay, well, what are we willing to lose and what do we want to save?
Yeah, I wonder if biodiversity it's almost sort of implicit in you consider recreation as a service, so it's in that layer as well, right? But then you're thinking about whether we want sort of fully protected areas as opposed to areas that are more accessible. But it's interesting that it's in that layer as well. But it'd be interesting to think about which areas have full protection as opposed to those that are more encouraged, like national parks for access and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that there's no one size fits all for conservation, either the conservation of ecosystem services or the access of them, right? Because as people receive the benefits of some of these things, it's not necessarily synonymous with conservation. One of the things we looked at was hydroelectricity, that come, and ton big dams in places like the Peace River in northern British Columbia. That is, by any stretch of biodiversity, ecological connectivity is a dreadful idea. We should not be putting that, but decisions are made based on a variety of reasons, sometimes with more or less evidence on one side of the ledger. And so in southern Canada, for instance, where we know there's tons of species at risk, it's more biodiverse because it's in southern latitudes. The decisions that'll be made in heavily fragmented, much more populated landscapes will be different to provide different services and to pay attention to biodiversity. Whereas in northern Canada, for instance, which is largely more intact, still has people in it. And we have to remember these are not, empty, pristine, these ideas of like, it's just nature out there. People live there. People have stewarded it for thousands of years, and they need to still have access to these things. We talk about it makes them who they are, Indigenous people specifically. And so we have to pay attention to different ideas about what conservation means. And certainly some of the ideas about Indigenous-led conservation that have been raised in the last, really come to the fore in the last few years in Canada, are going to be different ideas about, we're not necessarily, we might have national parks in some places, like national park reserves. Baidene, for instance, is a brand new one up in Great Slave Lake. But other ones will be Indigenous protected areas, or might have entirely new names that we haven't really conceived of before in conservation. And that's exciting. We should think about that. There's who does that serve? It might not serve the same people that protected areas have served in the past. Open to some of those new ideas. Make sure we still conserve biodiversity, still conserve the things that we all depend on from nature, but be cognizant of the different justice and social angles here.
Absolutely, yeah. I have some students reading a couple of papers now about knowledge co-production in the context of environmental monitoring of species at risk populations in the north, and it's got my brain spinning just thinking about how ecosystem services might fit into that. Could there be co-produced knowledge to think of maybe that nature's contribution to people idea, maybe that's, it fits in there, I think. But I digress. But I think Karen had a couple questions about sort of data analysis, that kind of thing.
Well, so first, I guess maybe like a bit of maybe a technical question. I don't know, kind of getting into the nitty gritty of your paper a little bit. So I was thinking about the freshwater service that you were, one of the three that you focused on in the paper, and thinking about this particular hotspot in the Rocky Mountains, and a lot of that freshwater, the runoff there is coming from snow melt, right, in springtime, and so that got me to sort of thinking about, to what extent, are these hotspots static, and how do we deal with that uncertainty, right? So I think about, as a climate scientist, I'm thinking that snowpack is going to, gradually disappear, and the freshwater ecosystem service there will diminish, and so there's some uncertainty. And if we're thinking about, protected areas and drawing lines around regions we want to protect, how does that uncertainty, how is that handled when you think about, strategies for protecting certain areas and things like that?
Well, Karen, I've been thinking about a lot of this stuff too, living in Alberta, and I live in these hotspots
Right.
for water. And climate change, especially, like the Rocky Mountain glaciers, 90% of them are predicted to be gone by the end of the century. 90% of the glaciers. And so much of the water that we get here is glacier melt. And that brings a whole host of other problems, like recent research, I think it was from UBC, that looked at the danger that's caused by these lakes that are at the bottom of glaciers, and dams that are there bursting, and how that might affect the thousands, or some parts of the world, millions of people who live downstream. For me, it emphasizes more and more in this specific place. So the eastern slopes of the Rockies, it's sort of the area from about Red Deer down south to the U.S. border, for folks who aren't looking at the map in front of them. And it just glows as a hotspot all across Canada. This is of national significance here. And for me, it emphasizes more and more, like, we have to be extraordinarily careful about decisions that are made in those headwaters. Calgary's predicted to have something like 27 more days a year that are above 30 degrees Celsius, called very hot days, in about 30 to 60 years time. And my life up to now, we've had about 5 or 6 days at that a year. So from 5 or 6 days a year up to more than 30, like, that's a huge difference. And water in this part of the world is going to become more and more important. But the idea about how you predict them, going forward, I think is a super interesting one, and not something that, we didn't do. Matt, I think we did talk about some of this stuff, like how as we were talking about what are limitations in what we're doing, you want to be aware of that. It doesn't stop you from doing the work, but you want to be cautious about how it's done. I don't know how we would do it. I think about it with recreation too, like how people actually go out and access these places. It's a neat question to mull over.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that I think about a lot, about the water and the prairies,
Mm-hmm.
both from the loss of glaciers and that snowmelt that's feeding a lot of the water, but also increases in demand for irrigation, given all the food that's going there, expansion of agriculture further north, like that's going to change that demand for agricultural areas where people live. All of these things are uncertainties into the future that can change things. The other uncertainty that we really don't grapple with very much in this paper, but I would love to do this, is just putting lines on a map and saying this is a park doesn't mean that you're actually going to protect the glaciers or the carbon that's in the soil, especially around something like climate change, right? And so I think that one of the challenges in Canada and around the world is, in the face of climate change and these really large environmental effects, what are the actions that we need to do to actually maintain those services, or how can we be resilient in the face of climate change? And that is a question I think that's a really big one, because it's not just about saying, oh, this is a protected area, it's going to solve all our problems. It's both on the capacity side, how do we make those ecosystems resilient, and also on the people side, what do we do so that maybe our demand decreases, or we find different ways of interacting with nature to get those benefits.
Yeah, like, Matt, it makes me think about the ideas, like, as humans, we're often looking for, how can I get more of something, right? This idea about this growth paradigm. And so how do we extract more out of nature, rather than how do we reduce some of our demands for these things? And I read a great op-ed in the Ottawa Hill Times about a month ago. Marina Melanides wrote it, from Youth for Nature. And one of the lines in it, I might get it a little bit wrong, but she was like, we can't plant our way out of a climate crisis. And it was in response to the federal government's idea that we're going to plant 2 billion trees, in the next, whatever it is, 20 years or something. And fundamentally, we can't just keep emitting more and more greenhouse gases and then imagine that we're going to, have this massive carbon sequestration. Fundamentally, we have to get, if we want to protect a stable climate, water, including recreation, all of the services, the benefits that people get, climate change is that overarching umbrella all over them. And number one, we've got to get our emissions down, to protect all of these things. So I'm excited for opportunities to work with, like, on implementation of this kind of stuff. The work that Matt and I and our co-authors have done helps to identify important places in across Canada. But then the next step is, okay, what actual management decisions will help to maintain those benefits? And Matt's right, they're not necessary. For some of them, it is certain kinds of protected areas. For others, it might not be. Right.
And did you consider, once you kind of had these maps in front of you and you can see sort of the hot spots, and this kind of makes me start to think about remediation or areas where kind of, these medium hotspots there could be some restoration projects, or did you start to think about some of those kind of ideas? For example, like increasing the carbon sink, planting, different forests or things like that?
I don't think we've gotten there yet, but I think that that's definitely occurred to me as well. Like, if you had a layer for a certain service, or you knew certain actions would improve that service, say, planting trees or different ways to increase soil carbon, and you knew across the country, okay, these are the places that have the possibility of doing this. You can overlay that and say, okay, where are those places where they're low carbon now, but we could actually have the greatest gain, and that sort of thing. I think that would be really interesting as well. The other thing that I've just been thinking about in the last day or two is, we looked at places with the highest capacity and demand. But what if we actually looked at where those places are that have really high demand for things, but not very much capacity? So, what are the actions we could do there to actually increase that capacity? Are there ways we can do that easily, whether it's through reclamation or other ways? Maybe that's another piece of, like, how do we conserve nature, and how do we address things like climate change as well?
It's akin to an idea maybe in the biodiversity literature, you may have come across this, the idea of dark diversity, where people will map either on a landscape or at a larger scale, the biodiversity that used to be there, prior to land use change. So I wonder, if that idea, maybe there's some value to thinking about ecosystem services as well as some kind of future paper. I don't know.
there's a whole bunch of work on kind of historical ecosystem services, looking at how much do they change through time and why and in what sort of patterns. The biggest challenge there, at least from the way that ecosystem services have been quantified, is where do you get the data to look back in time? So one of our co-authors, Elena Bennett, has done this a bunch in kind of Quebec and that sort of thing. There's a good data set there, but in other places it's much more difficult. And you know, makes me start thinking about what about traditional knowledge? Like, are there ways that we can actually bring those things together to see how things have changed in the past and why, and be able to use that knowledge to actually push it into the future and be able to manage better into the future.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. Karen, I'll let you keep going there.
Well, so actually, you mentioned this idea of data and how, you know, we didn't have data in the past, and one of the things I noted in your paper and listening to some of your other interviews is like this emphasis on open data and open access, and so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that and the importance of that in terms of this type of work that you're doing.
Yeah, it was important for us to publish the paper to be open access to people, and then to make a companion. Our co-author Richard Schuster at Carleton University made this wonderful data visualization, which helps people, you know, fly around the map themselves and zoom in on places that they care about. And we mapped these things at a national scale where data were available. I think we're also, and some of the services we didn't map, like we talked about initially, wouldn't it be cool if we could do X? Then from some initial investigation, we found, you know, the data don't exist at the scale that we're looking at, which is really problematic, right? For you know, for a country as big as Canada that, you know, that has a lot of resources at its disposal, like we should be developing those kind of maps. And however, I think we've also talked about it's, especially for things where it's people benefit and not everybody benefits equally. I think it's very important for people to recognize that, you know, there might be a desire of scientists to help various communities, but it should be up to those communities to decide what they want to do with their knowledge and their information. So I see this tension happening quite a bit where well-meaning scientists will talk about all data should be open and the democratization of science. And then, but it's also a lot of naivete about, you know, decisions are not made with all people in mind. Not everybody is at the table. And it should be up to communities who have that community developed knowledge and sensitive knowledge, culturally held information, to decide if and when they want to share it, because it may not be to their benefit. So as we talk about how information like this can be used to support, for instance, Indigenous-led land use planning, it's not that like people like Matt or me would go to those communities and say, we'll do it for you, but rather we want to say, here's some new information that you might consider in the work that you're doing. We're happy to help if you want. And if you don't want us to be involved, that's okay, right? It's scientists needing to have that humility to offer what we can, but also to recognize that science has not necessarily helped all people equally.
Do you feel that, you know, in Canada, I guess specifically, that people are tending to value ecosystem services more, or is there a recognition that, you know, in my own life living in Toronto, like do people see the value more than they did maybe 10 years ago? And do we see that maybe, you know, some momentum, some public pressure could move the needle, as you said, Aerin, or what do you think?
You know, I think this last year has been hard for so many people that one of the things that has certainly helped me be physically healthy, mentally healthy, or, you know, as much as one can approach that in 2020 and 2021 is access to nature. Yeah, we know that we need these places, and there is fundamentally nothing more important to us as people than water. Right, water is the foundation of everything. So, insofar as I see people from all walks of life coming together in the province that I live in Alberta, recently it's been around water and the threats that proposed coal mining have to the water sources for people. You know, millions of people who live in Edmonton, live in Lethbridge. And so, yes, I think there's more recognition about that importance, whether it translates to we need both individual action and we need systemic change for those things. That's what we still need to see.
Yeah.
that's a great question. I was reflecting on when my dad was, doing land use plans in BC and protected area strategies. The goal in the 90s, I think, was 12 or 15% of the province protected at that time. And I don't think I could have, or people involved in that could have conceived of a target like something like 30% of Canada, not let alone something like BC protected. And so just thinking about, hopefully that's quick enough, these changes that are happening, but there has been a change. If we're talking about 30% being conserved in Canada, and I really, really hope that that is an actual target we will achieve, and it's not just something we're talking about. Like there has been a change over those 30 years, and I think that I take some hope from that. But I think that we also the threats also have increased at the same time, and so that's the thing that we really need to work on is like, can we also reduce the threats at the same time as we're protecting 30% or more of our land and our waters and that sort of thing. So
how do we live sustainably on the rest, right? Like the ideas of nature needs half or half Earth. It doesn't mean that people aren't in the half that's protected, and it doesn't mean that it's a free for all in the other half, right? Ultimately, we have to learn how to live within nature's limits.
Yeah, that's a nice hopeful message, I think, to end on. Do you think, Aerin? Yeah, I think there's positive change, but we need to be cognizant of all these threats that are happening, and it's by no means a blanket solution or a blanket impact across Canada. It's very much something that happens at the local scale as well. But we can think about our national contribution to biodiversity and ecosystem services. So we just wanted to thank you both for taking the time to join us today. And
thank you so much.
Congrats again on the paper. It's fantastic. And we're happy to be able to share this work on our podcast. We're looking forward to seeing your future output, both in the NGO conservation world. Y2Y is such a great initiative as well that we could have a whole other podcast about that, I think. For sure. Yeah. And Matthew as well. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll keep a keen eye on your work.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you both.
Thanks for having us. It's fun to work on these kind of things, and also for the students that you work with. Change can happen, and it needs all of us to be involved, and it feels good. Like, it feels good to get involved, right? Apathy's boring.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.